Government Business Order of the Day number 4, 100th anniversary of the landings at Gallipoli, resumption of debate on the motion moved by the Prime Minister.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm indeed honoured and humbled to participate in this discussion of the 100th anniversary of the landings at Gallipoli, the motion moved by the Honourable the Prime Minister. Mr Deputy Speaker, 100 years ago, Turkey repulsed the British and French fleet at Gallipoli, decisively ending their attempt to force the Straits. 4 days later, the fateful decision was made to commit to an amphibious landing at Gallipoli. From this vantage point, 100 years later, the Gallipoli campaign marked a turning point in the history of two nations that have been together ever since, Australia and New Zealand. For the great imperial powers of Europe, locked in the lethal stalemate on the Western Front, Gallipoli was in fact something of a sideline. A fleet of obsolete vessels and a relatively small force, reinforced by untested colonials, would attempt to break the stalemate by reopening a sea route to the Russians in the Black Sea, and thus drawing Turkish troops away from the Caucasian theatre of operations. It ultimately failed this objective. So, from the Anglo-French perspective, the campaign that we commemorate the centenary of this year at Gallipoli was merely one failed attempt to break the stalemate in Europe. For the Ottoman Command, the campaign was critical to prevent the opening up of a new front that they could ill afford. From this perspective, the successful defence of Gallipoli should have been a victory that ensured the survival of the Ottoman Empire. But with the clear-eyed hindsight of history, we can see this campaign today in a very different light. For the fledgling nations of Turkey, Australia and New Zealand, this encounter, this great battle at Gallipoli, is now remembered as a critical juncture in the birth of independent nationhood. Indeed, for the Turks under Kemal Ataturk, since regarded as the father of modern Turkey, it was the beginning of a new nation. And far from being a failure, this was the campaign in which Australia and New Zealand proved to the world and to themselves that they could survive the withering heat of modern warfare. And as we look back, it's sometimes difficult to remember how modern that warfare was. The First World War was the war which included the last cavalry charges in history, and yet was the war that included aeroplanes for the first time, wars that included people on bicycles and people in a modern new invention, the tank. It was a critical juncture in terms of war. And in this great historical irony, what appeared to be a great victory for the Ottoman Empire was in fact a watershed moment for the nationalist movement that was to replace it. For Australia's official war historian, Charles E.W. Bean, the 25th of April 1915 was the day, to quote him, "The consciousness of Australian nationhood was born." Bean made it clear that the Australians did not fight because of any hatred of the Turks. Rather, he said, the big thing in the war for Australia was the discovery of the character of Australians. It was character which rushed the hills at Gallipoli and held on there. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, it was that same character, the recognition of the character of so many that died in that great war from this country, that was commemorated by tens, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people around Australia on Anzac Day and events surrounding Anzac Day this year. And my electorate was no different to the electorates of all the other members of this place. At Warrandyte, where at the dawn service some 3,500 to 4,000 members of the local community came out to commemorate the centenary of Anzac. At Templestowe, at the RSL, where at the morning service some 3,000 people came out, numbers vastly and significantly more than the services at which large numbers of people turn up each other year. At the Doncaster RSL, at the dawn service, where again some 2,500 people attended. Even at the Donvale Rehabilitation Hospital, some 200 people compared to maybe 50 on other occasions. And then throughout the electorate at local football ovals where there were services during the day, and at the Croydon RSL, where again at the dawn service some 3,000 people attended that. So I'd like to place on record our appreciation for the presidents, the chairs and the committee and office bearers of each of those RSLs who year after year organise these memorial events, to Hank van der Helm, who was standing in for John Pearson at Warrandyte, to Michael Flanagan at Templestowe, to Charles Collins at Doncaster, and to Edward Sam Berry at Croydon. For the first time in 24 years I wasn't able to attend the services in my own electorate, Mr Deputy Speaker, because I was representing the government on Anzac Day at the Western Front, which I'll come to in a moment. But when I returned after being in Europe for Anzac Day, I organised a morning tea at the Doncaster RSL, in which I invited members of the Return Services Leagues from each of the various organisations in district to that. We had some 80 or so people in attendance on that day, and it was my opportunity to say to them on behalf of a grateful nation and on behalf particularly of the constituents of Menzies how much we appreciated the ongoing work that they do. And it's not just Anzac Day each year, it's commemoration of other events on Remembrance Day, the Battle of Long Tan, but also the ongoing work that they do for people, particularly veterans and their families, through Legacy and other organisations in the electorate. It's something which we in this country can be very proud of. As I said, Mr Deputy Speaker, I was honoured to represent the government on Anzac Day on the Western Front, particularly at the dawn service at Villa Bretoneur, where there were some 7,000 people who withstood the cold driving rain before dawn and the time at dawn for that service, which is held there each year. Then most of them walked back the 3 or 4 kilometres into the small village of Villa Bretoneur, where the mayor had provided a breakfast, and then there was a town service in Villa Bretoneur as well. There's also a wonderful concert of school children from not only Villa Bretoneur but other villages around the area, which the Australian government helps to fund and gives out a number of awards to students each year. And it was wonderful to see the local students singing Waltzing Matilda and other Australian songs amongst their repertoire at that town service. We later drove some 2 hours and stopped in the middle of the fields, which was once the bloody, muddy fields of World War I, where the locals in the 1920s erected a small cross called Le Petit Croix, where each year we stopped the representatives of the Government of Australia along with local French men and women to commemorate the First World War, before going on to Bulcourt, again another scene of ferocious fighting during the First World War, where 2,000 to 3,000 people, mostly Australians and New Zealanders, were there in attendance by then on a warm afternoon on the Somme for the town service, which involves commemoration of both the Australians and the local French fighters from the First World War, followed by a march for about 1 kilometre or so out to the Digger Memorial in the fields where the war occurred, the fronts in the First World War for that service. And We concluded the day then driving to Ypres in Belgium, Mr Speaker, where, as we know, there's that famous service at Menengate, which has been held every day of the year, every night of the year for decades now. And again, there were thousands of people who were gathered there on that occasion for that service to mark the special time of Anzac Day. And I was privileged to be there along with my New Zealand counterpart, the Minister for Defence from New Zealand, the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, to lay wreaths at Menengate. On all of these occasions, whether it was overseas at the Western Front, whether it was the people who went to Gallipoli, whether it was local services in your electorate and my electorate, Mr Speaker, on this occasion hundreds of thousands of Australians turned out to those services because this was such a significant occasion in the history of this country, and for us to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Gallipoli is something which is so important for this Parliament to do.
I thank the Minister.